G'day guys, John here, Chief Instructor with FPV Australia. It's a bit of an ugly day outside. It's rainy and windy and cold. So what better day than to sit here on the couch with old Sparky and have a chat to you a little bit about Chief Pilot responsibilities. As some of you know, we've been training a while now, back in 2014 when we kicked all this off. So we've put a lot of pilots through that have gone on to be Chief Pilots, and a lot has changed since some of those guys and girls went through. But even now, today, I'm finding a lot of Chief Pilots are sort of scratching their heads sometimes about what is actually required and what are the responsibilities of a Chief Pilot. And there's the obvious ones, you know, approve jobs, approve flights for your other pilots, but then there's some that go down a bit granular and you might not be aware of them. So this video, I thought I'd go through what the Chief Pilot's responsibilities are, and maybe raise an issue that you might not have been aware of, or clear up some confusion for you. So let's go. This is all based off the standard manual template that is currently available on the CASA website, and today is the 7th of June, so 2018. So the templates that are currently available on the website, that's what I'm going to go through now and pull out the bits that I think you should be focusing on. First and foremost, what is the responsibilities of a Chief Pilot? Well, the Chief Pilot's job is to look after the drones, the operation of the drones, and the operations of any pilots, including himself, obviously, under that ReOC. For example, XYZ company has a Chief Remote Pilot and 5 pilots underneath them. The Chief Remote Pilot will be approving the jobs as they come through upon request from the pilots. He has to maintain all of their records and so forth, and all that stuff that goes with it. And it gets pretty granular, and that's what I want to break down today for you. Firstly, there's a difference between what the CEO and the director's job is as opposed to the Chief Pilot. And there is some confusion. And I've had a few conversations with people saying, you know, the director can overrule the Chief Pilot in regards to the operations of the drones. That's actually incorrect. If the Chief Pilot deems the job not doable, maybe it's against the law, or maybe it's going to breach something, the director of the company's got no say. The Chief Remote Pilot is the one responsible for the operations of the drones. So let's get that out of the way. But let's go through the manual, and I'll pull out the bits that are important. I'll put them up on the wall here behind me. The first bit I want to bring your attention to in the manual set is a 0.4, the amendment procedure. This is where the company director or the CEO comes in, and his job is responsible for, you know, any changes to the company's name and address. You know, obviously let CASA know that, because the ReOC is attached to that company name and address. If the Chief Remote Pilot or the maintenance controller, and I'll do a maintenance officer's video at another date, but if that Chief Pilot resigns and decides to go about their merry way somewhere else, well then the company has to tell CASA, because the ReOC cannot operate without a Chief Pilot. And then a new Chief Pilot gets nominated and away we go. It doesn't mean that the ReOC gets cancelled, it just gets suspended, put on hold, can't operate without a Chief Pilot. And if there's any changes to the company organisation, like the company goes bankrupt or whatever else, again, someone needs to inform the regulator of that. So that's that out of the way. The rest of this is all Chief Pilot responsibility. So let's get rolling. What are the responsibilities? If you look in the manual set, 1.4.2, up here behind me, responsibilities of the Chief Remote Pilot. I've got it here in front of me so I can relate. Ensure that the operations are conducted in compliance with the civil aviation regulations. Obviously, his job is to make sure that any flying that happens under that ReOC does not fall outside the regulation. That's foremost the ultimate, okay? Everything has to be done within the law. You've got to maintain records of each qualified remote pilot. So what does that mean? Well, that means if XYZ company hires Fred, the Chief Remote Pilot has to ensure that Fred is able to hold that position, obviously, and then maintain his records and qualifications. So have a copy of his remote pilot's license or controller civic or whatever else, all the other stuff that he's got, and look after that. Monitor and maintain operational standards and supervise the remote pilots who work under the authority of the ReOC. What does that mean? Well, exactly what it says. The Chief Pilot is responsible for everything that happens, and the remote pilots report to him, and he has to make sure that all of that is supervised, I guess is the good choice of word. Maintain a complete up-to-date reference library of operational documents required by CASA for the class of operations being conducted. In other words, the operations library, which I'll do in a separate video as well. That's the Chief Pilot's responsibility, the operations library, all the procedures that are lined up and outlined for how things get done. That's the Chief Pilot's responsibility to maintain that record and as it says, maintain that the standards are up to speed. keeping across everything, I guess. Develop applications for approvals and permissions where required. In other words, if you need to apply for an application to fly in restricted access, Sydney Harbour, Sydney Harbour, for example, things like that, within 3 nautical miles, that's the chief pilot's responsibility to put those applications in. Develop checklists and procedures relating to flight operations. Yep, so all of the aircraft have to have pre- and post-flight checklists and all that sort of stuff, as well as procedures for abnormal operations and all that sort of stuff. That's all in the library. We'll come to that in another video. Be the point of contact with CASA. This is an important one, and I've seen a couple of companies get caught with this one. The chief remote pilot is the one that deals with the Civil Aviation Safety Authority. Unless that chief pilot resigns and bails out, he is the single point of, or she is the single point of contact for CASA. Notify CASA prior to any changes to this manual or its schedule. Important. This one catches pilots out. If you make a change to your lineup of your aircraft, i.e. you've brought a new aircraft online, maybe you've added a fixed wing, maybe you've, I don't know, gone out and bought an M210, whatever it is, you actually need to update the Schedule 1 in the manuals. It's in the manuals. It's a schedule that says what the aircraft is and, you know, its weight and all that sort of stuff. And you need to send that through, the chief pilot needs to send that through to the regulator. That needs to be updated. If you take an aircraft out of service, if your M210 dies or you've sold it, or if you've crashed it, that's a different story. We'll come back to that. But if you've sold it or you've taken it out of service for whatever reason and it's no longer going to be operated under the ReOC, you also need to advise the regulator. So that's sort of them in a nutshell. But let's start to break down some other things that pop up that might not be glaringly obvious. If you read through your manuals, which you are meant to as a chief remote pilot, you will see all of these lined up. Let's look at the next one, 1.5.1.3 in the current template. Fatigue management. And there's a statement there, I won't read it all out, but it basically says that the chief pilot is responsible to make sure that he's not driving his pilots into the ground. There is fatigue management requirements, and that takes into consideration how far the pilot has to travel. Have you put him on a 12-hour drive to get somewhere over, you know, and then fly for the next 12, like, you know, you're responsible to make sure that chief pilot, that remote pilot's on his game. It might sound a little silly, but it isn't. Standing out in the paddock for 5 hours in the blazing sun, we teach this in our classroom. Human factors go through the roof. So it's the chief pilot's responsibility to make sure that the job being asked for is not going to stretch the pilot beyond the point where his OH&S issues come into play, I guess. So that's one that gets overlooked a lot. So think about that. That's the chief remote pilot's responsibility. 1.5.2, transportation of dangerous goods. Again, chief pilot is responsible. If you approve a job and the guy's got to get on a plane and take off and go across state to do a job, it's the chief remote pilot's responsibility to make sure his pilot understands that the transportation of the dangerous goods under the ReOC is being adhered to, all the ICAO standards, you know, the stuff we teach in the classroom about what you can carry on a plane, what you can't, all that sort of stuff. That again falls back on ultimately the chief remote pilot. His job to make sure his pilots are well aware of the law and what is required of them, I guess. 1.5.3.3, remote pilots to be competent. Again, this, I'm surprised at how many chief remote pilots I've spoken to that actually overlook this. It is the chief remote pilot's responsibility to make sure his pilots are competent and current on type. In other words, let's just hypothetically say you got your OC 4 years ago and you've got 3 pilots flying for you and you've never once put them through a flight check. You've never once looked at them as competency as to how they fly and sat down with them and spoken about rules and regulations and all that sort of stuff. You're actually in breach. You need to make sure you've got records kept of how often and when and all that sort of stuff that you have put your pilots through some sort of, you know, competency check, I guess, if you want to call it. Again, that falls back on the chief remote pilot. So again, if you're a remote pilot out there working for an organisation, you've got pilots underneath you, including yourself. You don't fall outside of this as the chief. There should be records kept of who and when people have been deemed competent and how and why. And there's a number of ways you can do that. Another one that's quirky that catches people out. 1.5.4.3, handover takeover procedures. This is in the manuals. This is in the current manual set, and it says, and I'll quickly read it, in normal operations, the handover of RPA controls from one remote pilot to another whilst the RPA is in flight is not permitted under normal operation. In other words, if you're just out there flying, you've got two pilots on site, you're doing the job, and the drone's in the air, unless there's an extenuating circumstance, you're not supposed to hand controls over to the other pilot. And it states it clearly in 1543, as you can see behind me. If that's going to happen, then it needs to be approved by the chief pilot, and it says it clearly here. Again, the operation must be approved by the chief remote pilot in accordance with the handover procedures detailed in the library. So if you're going to allow pilots to change willy-nilly during the flight, there has to be procedures written into the library, and they have to be written and approved by the chief pilot. Again, just little things that aren't glaringly obvious that are in the manuals, and we're all bound by them. If that's in your manual, and you know it's been accepted by CASA when you went and got your ReOC, then you're bound by them. So again, you need to be reading through the manuals and checking. There's another one actually that comes up. I haven't dug it out here, but it's just come to mind. Is there's a statement written in the manuals that says, unless approved by the chief remote pilot, the remote pilot must ensure that the drone is not flown within 500 foot vertically or 1,500 metres horizontally from an aircraft. In other words, if the job gets approved and there's no other extenuating circumstances, and a chopper turns up within a kilometre operating, then according to the manual set, the remote pilot has to land the aircraft. Now, I'm wondering how many chief pilots out there have briefed their pilots on that and said, look, if you're out and about, normal operation, if you see an aircraft operating within a 1.5k radius of you or 500 foot above your head, you get out of the sky. I'm sure those conversations in a lot of organisations probably haven't happened, but it's in the manual. The chief pilot can approve operations that breach that one. That's not a regulation, it's just a recommendation from CASA, and hence why it says unless approved by the chief pilot. But there needs to be documentation of that during the flight authorisation or the job safety assessment that said, you know, we're going to continue to operate within 1.5 k's of an active aircraft because we've got this mitigation strategy and all that. So anyway, that's chief pilot responsibility. So think about that. Part C, internal training. This comes up in a lot of discussions I have with chief pilot. The chief pilot, unless he nominates another one of his pilots, they can't on-train another pilot for internal operations of the drones. That's the chief pilot's job. And there's a clause 3.1 that says persons permitted to conduct training. Only those persons nominated by the chief can do that. Records have to be kept. 3.2 says record keeping. If you have a bit of a read of that statement, it goes on about records that have to be kept to show that training took place. So if you know a guy comes in as a new pilot and the chief pilot's responsibility is to induct that pilot into the organisation, you can't just hire someone and go, there you go mate, off go fly this job. There has to be an induction process, and the chief pilot has to keep records of that induction process as to you know what you did and all that sort of stuff, and make sure that pilot's aware of the procedures and all the stuff that's associated with your ReOC. There's an absolute process, and the chief pilot must keep records of all of that. Another one that comes up a lot, and I'm very fearful that there's a lot of ReOCs operating out there that aren't quite aware of their obligations under the night operation exemption. Remember a little while ago, we were all given a blanket approval, ReOC holders that is, all given a blanket approval to operate at night. But it isn't just blanket. I speak to a lot of operators that scratch their head when I tell them that you, one, have to adopt those procedures into your current ReOC and then notify the regulator, because there's changes to the manual that have to take place. So you can't just go, oh, we've all got a blanket approval, let's go operate at night. It doesn't work that way. Firstly, all the manuals and stuff have to be changed, all the procedures have to go in the operations library. Chief pilot must make sure all that's in play, let the regulator know. And if you look at that approval, it states that there are procedures and training that need to be approved. And again, if you read it, it states that if you take CASA's model that they've released and the training syllabus that they've released that are in the current templates, they're deemed to be approved. So you've got to take them, put them in your manuals, let the regulator know you've got them. Great, step one. Step two, you have to put your pilots through the training. You have to come up with training components that match the syllabus that CASA have put out and put your pilots through that training, demonstrate that you've done that, sign it all off and file it And so that there's proof that you as the chief pilot have put your pilots through that training. Now, what if you're the only pilot? What if you're a sole chief pilot? Well, the strange thing is, there's no differential between chief pilot and remote pilot. They're all pilots, and every pilot has to go through it. So you need to develop a training regime that matches the syllabus, go through it, sign it off, and file it. Until that happens, you're not legally allowed to fly at night under the ReOC. And there's so many pilots I've spoken to scratch their head and go, really? Do I have to do that? Yeah, you do. So make sure that you've put all of the procedures in your manuals. You've got some sort of training package that matches the syllabus, and you've put all the pilots, including yourself, through that, signed it off and filed it. That has to happen. Operations within controlled airspace. This is really an interesting one. I noticed this talking to another pilot that I don't think a lot of pilots are aware of. It seems to be one of those ones that gets completely lost in translation. There is a clause, believe it or not, in the manual that states that if you're going to operate a drone within controlled airspace, it can't be done unless there's an AROC person on site and a radio on site. And the chief pilot, it says something along the lines of the chief pilot must ensure that a drone is not approved for flight in controlled airspace unless that pilot has these approvals. I'll put it up here on the board behind me and you can see it. It's not a regulation, but it's a condition in the OC. And I was shocked. I've spoken to a lot of pilots who are, approving jobs inside a CTR, for instance, which is controlled airspace, outside the 3 nautical miles. So you're not near the airport. You don't need air services approval, but you're still in controlled airspace, and not realising that there's actually conditions that are in the OC, in the manuals that you've agreed to when you submitted, that you have to abide by. So check that one out as well, because that's one that keeps coming up and I keep going, wow, you didn't know this. Moving on, accident and reporting, 444 in the current manual template. The chief pilot is responsible to report any crashes, any injuries, any accidents that happen to the drone. So for instance, if you crash a drone and it crashes and it breaks, there's an obligation to report it. Again, I've had a lot of conversations with guys who scratch their heads and go, oh, but no one was hurt, or, it was my aircraft, I destroyed it. Yeah, okay, we hit a tree and the aircraft smashed, it's gone, we threw it in the bin. Did you report it? Oh, no. Well, hang on. You have to. You're obliged to. The manuals state you must. Again, it doesn't matter that nobody was hurt. If the aircraft was destroyed, firstly, you should be advising the regulator that the aircraft is now gone. It's no longer on the ReOC. Remember Schedule 1, we spoke about that at the start. That should be advised, hey, we don't have this drone anymore. It's gone, we crashed it. But you should also report the crash. That's in your manuals, 444, have a read. And just touching back again on the controlled airspace, 4447, here's the bit 447, here's the bit I was talking about. The chief remote pilot will not authorise operations within Class C airspace unless the remote pilot has any of the above qualifications, and there they are there. And the first one, obviously, most of us will fall into is the air radio, the AROC. Certain people are exempt from that, as you can see in that at the top, but it clearly states, will not authorise operations within Class E space unless the remote pilot has the above. So again, if there's a pilot operating for you that doesn't actually have an AROC, maybe they didn't get it, maybe they don't qualify because of language issues. There's a whole bunch of reasons why maybe someone doesn't have an AROC. We do our best to make sure every student that comes through our course gets an AROC. Then he or she's not allowed to fly in controlled airspace without that AROC. Again, these are things that are in the manuals that might not be glaringly obvious. And so what I implore all of you chief remote pilots, even you guys that may have had your AROC your ReOC for a long time, that go right back to the early part of all this, back in 2014, sit down and read your manuals cover to cover. You are bound by a whole bunch of stuff that might not be in regulation, okay? i.e. the 1500 metre, 500 foot rule. That's not a regulation. There's no regulation that says you will not operate an aircraft within a drone within 1.5 kilometres horizontally or 500 foot vertically of an aircraft. It's not in regulation, but it's in the manuals that unless it's authorised by the chief pilot, it can't happen. Which means The remote pilot has to know that before doing the job, because if a plane or a chopper turns up, he's obliged to get out of the way, as per the manuals. So the overarching theme here is the chief remote pilot has to ensure that his pilots are well aware of everything that's in the manuals. That's part of the manuals, is to ensure that they're across it, they've read it, and they sign off on it. I'm just wondering how many ReOCs, and maybe they're all one person ReOC, so just a chief pilot. He's the only guy in the business. Is not adhering to a lot of these little conditions that are inside the manuals. I reckon there's heaps. Look, I hope this is cleared up. I could sit here and go on for the next sort of hour, I guess, in regards to all of these finite details. But you just need to read your manuals. There's a lot has changed since some of you guys got your manuals, and maybe you haven't adopted the latest template. And that's another thing you can do right now. You can adopt the latest template and download the latest template from CASA and move your manuals over to that. We can assist you with that as well. We've helped a lot of people do that. And then read them cover to cover as a chief pilot and know what your responsibilities are. It's more than just ticking the box for a job. I want to fly here. I want to film the wedding? Yeah, okay, it looks good. Airspace is great. Tick. There's a lot of undertones that need to be looked at as well. So, look, I hope that's helped. I hope it might have answered some of the questions. Maybe it's brought your attention to some things you weren't aware of. If you've still got questions that maybe I've touched on something that you want, I want clarity on that, send us an email, simply training@fpvaustralia.com.au. We'll go into the main box where we all get visual on that. It's in case I'm not around or I'm training or I'm doing something. Training@fpvaustralia.com.au. You can call us directly now on 1300 FPV-Oz, 1300 FPV-AUS. Or just jump on our website if you want these contact details at a later date and can't remember them, fpvaustralia.com.au. If you've got a particular topic that you'd like me to cover and that I might not have covered here, I'm going to talk about the maintenance officer's responsibility in another video, as well as the library and sort of what its job is in all of this and how it works. But if you've got a particular topic that you'd like me to cover on the couch here, give us a yell. Send me an email, whatever it is, and I'll happily look into it for you and maybe do a bit of a spotlight video on that to bring a bit of attention to it. Anyway, I hope you're keeping warm this cold and miserable winter day, although we do need the rain, so I'm happy to see it falling. But if you are flying a drone today, tomorrow, next week, or next month, please do so safely and responsibly. We really do need safe skies for all. Enjoy.